Please welcome Cleveland Clinic's CEO and President, Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm delighted to see you all here. We started the Ideas for Tomorrow program to expand on our global perspective. We invite speakers to share their views on people, issues, and events that affect all of our lives. Healthcare really has no boundaries. Science is universal. The wise man belongs to all countries. The world today is a mixture of peace and conflict. No place on earth shows this more dramatically than the Middle East. It is the cradle of civilization and the focus of international tension. It is the home of millions of people with the same hopes and aspirations as our own. Our guest today is a renowned expert on the Middle East. He has been hailed as an objective observer and a bridge between nations. Karim Sadjadpour is a first-generation American with Persian descent. He speaks 4 languages, has traveled widely in the Middle East. He's the author of Reading Khomeini, the worldview of Iran's most powerful leader. As a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he writes, lectures, and comments on Middle Eastern affairs. His specialty is Islamic Republic of Iran. It is a nation with a long and complex history. In 1979, revolutionaries overthrew Iran's 400-year-old monarchy. American diplomats were taken hostage. Relations between the U.S. and Iran have been tense ever since. Today, Iran's nuclear program is a cause for additional concern. But Iran is not the only story in the Middle East. In Egypt, the new government is struggling to achieve democracy. Israel faces pressures from inside and outside its borders. Syria, protests have turned into full-scale civil war. We look forward to our guest's insight on these and other crucial world affairs. His opinion is sought around the world, and as you'll see from this video,
Dissent, dictatorship, democracy, disputes. Throughout time, the world has struggled with power. The Middle East is no exception.
Tensions mounting over Iran's nuclear program.
We cannot allow the Ayatollahs in Tehran to have a nuclear weapon.
As tension and threats mount, one voice provides unique insight into these ever-changing global relationships. Karim Sadjadpour was born and raised in Michigan. The son of Iranian immigrants, his father intended to go back to Iran until the revolution in 1979 caused him to change his mind.
This was instilled in us from the time we were small, that this, deep appreciation for Iran and the history and the culture of Iran, but also the opportunities that the United States represents.
He attended the University of Michigan, aspiring to become a professional soccer player.
My sophomore year in college, I had an injury and I had to hang up the boots and focus more on academics.
Karim Sadjadpour quickly found his passion for world affairs and completed a double major in political science and film. He went on to earn his master's degree at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He would then return to the land his parents left behind, Iran, as an analyst with the International Crisis Group, an organization dedicated to preventing and resolving violent conflict. It was an experience that would define the next step of his career.
For more insight on tomorrow's election in Iran,
Karim Sadjadpour is an associate.
Karim Sadjadpour is an Iran expert.
Now a senior associate at one of America's oldest and most prestigious think tanks, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Karim Sadjadpour has been seen on every major network, and he contributes to BBC TV and radio, CNN, National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, and Al Jazeera.
Do you buy that they might be willing to plot attacks?
I'm skeptical, and what's paramount for the Iranian Supreme Leader is to stay in power. And if they were to commit a major act of terror on the United States, I think he would be gambling with his own life and the life of the regime itself.
Frequently called upon to brief world leaders, he regularly testifies before Congress and has lectured at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford universities. In 2007, He was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Philanthropically, he serves as a board member of the Banu Foundation, an organization dedicated to assisting groups empowering women worldwide. In a world where chaos and concern extends beyond borders, Karim Sadjadpour offers compassion and understanding.
It's interesting in my work that I work so much on U.S.-Iran relations, and I really care deeply about both countries.
A humanitarian driven by equality and fairness, with a vision for international peace.
Please join me in welcoming Karim Sadjadpour. Delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming this evening. It's really a tremendous honor and a privilege to be here. And I don't think I'll ever be able to match up to that incredibly generous introduction, but it truly is an honor to be here and to be here with Dr. Cosgrove, who I admire tremendously. What the video didn't mention is that my father is a neurologist. He's 81 years old. He's still a practicing neurologist. And when I was in college, my first 2 years of college, I was actually pre-med. And it wasn't until, as you saw, I had that soccer injury and I had to spend a week in the hospital that I no longer became pre-med. But on my flight over here, I was reminded of a joke which is very popular in the Iranian American community. And it's about the first Iranian American president of the United States. And as he's being inaugurated, his mother elbows the vice president-elect. And she says, you see that guy over there? The vice president-elect says, do you mean the president-elect? And she said, yeah, you know, his brother is a doctor. So I have tremendous admiration for the work that all of you do. And one of the prominent debates these days in Washington is whether we've reached a post-American world, whether America is in decline. And when I come to places like the Cleveland Clinic, I always think that is a fantastic example of the reverse of that trend line, of really what separates America from the rest of the world. So, like the medical world, I think that the world of foreign policy, you have maladies, you have foreign policy challenges which are interrelated. They're oftentimes contagious, and there's oftentimes no cure for them. There's oftentimes no resolution to them. These are foreign policy challenges which you simply have to manage, challenges which you have to contain, but challenges, as I said, which aren't really resolvable. And I think this is especially true in the Middle East. I would love to be able to come to you and tell you that I have the answer for peace in the Middle East, or I have the silver bullet which is going to resolve these challenges which America faces. But I think, much like the Cold War, we're in a situation in which we're dealing with these remarkable challenges which are very fast-moving, they're interrelated, and we're really just doing our best to contain these challenges, not resolve them. But I thought what I'd do is kind of give you the worldview from Washington. You know, how does it look from the vantage point of President Obama? And I think the events in today's Middle East, there's two wonderful quotes from the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which I think brilliantly capture what's taking place in today's Middle East. And the first quote is from Lenin. And he said that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens. And then sometimes weeks pass and decades happen. And I think this brilliantly captures the situation in a country like Egypt, places like Syria, Libya, Tunisia, places that were almost frozen in time under the same autocratic rule, kind of immune to the forces of the trend lines of democratization, which were taking place elsewhere in the world, kind of immune to the forces of globalization. And you see suddenly in a period of weeks and months and years, that transformation that didn't take place over decades is happening in a very short span of time. And I think it's going to take at least a decade to see how the dust settles. It's an ongoing process. I'm reminded of the famous quote from the Chinese premier who was asked a few decades back what he thought about the French Revolution. And he said it's too early to tell. And I think likewise, it's far too early to tell where this quote-unquote Arab Spring is taking us. Now, the second quote from the Russian Revolution is from Trotsky. And he was talking about dictatorships. And he said that while they rule, their collapse appears inconceivable. And after they've fallen, their collapse appeared inevitable. And I think this quote brilliantly captures the situation of Iran, which is, it's an ancient country ruled by an Islamic republic, which is deeply unpopular, but at the same time very powerful. And I think that those of us who cover Iran are almost in unanimity in saying that in the short term, the Iranian regime doesn't appear to be on the verge of collapse like the Mubarak regime in Egypt. But over the long term, it's not a sustainable business model that they're running in Iran. And what I want to do is focus most of my introductory comments today on Iran. In the question session, I'm happy to go back and take a broader view of the region. But let me, as I promised, kind of offer you a view from the Oval Office. What are the challenges President Obama is facing? And I think when he looks around at the world, there's immediately 7 foreign policy challenges which are obvious. And the first, which has been kind of the issue which he focused on most in his first term when it comes to foreign policy, is Afghanistan. And the so-called surge in Afghanistan and preparing for an eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Second issue, I would argue, is Iraq. That's an issue in which we've spent as a nation enormous amounts in blood and treasure. And I think one of the primary challenges of Obama's presidency is reducing our footprint in Iraq, withdrawing from Iraq. The third challenge, which is a perennial challenge when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which successive U.S. presidents have spent a great deal of time on to no avail. This conflict has been raging for now close to 6 decades, and there's really no end in sight. The fourth challenge, which has really emerged in the last couple of years, is what I would call now a civil war in Syria. It started out, the uprisings in Syria began similarly to the way they began in Egypt and Tunisia. It was kind of a civil revolt from a repressed population. But I think the overwhelming brutality of the Assad regime has turned what was once a civil protest into now a civil war. And there are now upwards of 80,000 casualties in Syria, over 1 million people displaced. And I think this is a huge foreign policy challenge for President Obama. So I call that the fourth challenge. The fifth issue is the issue of terrorism. And we've seen terrorism just recently in the city of Boston. And we have, we're dealing with terrorist groups ranging from Al-Qaeda and their interests and ambitions throughout the Middle East, on U.S. soil, groups like Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Hamas, who are labeled terrorist groups by the U.S. government. And this is a perennial challenge. The sixth issue I would say is energy security. Where is the United States going to get its energy resources from? And is the global energy supply secure for the world at large? And the seventh issue, which has been a huge issue with regards to Iran, is the issue of nuclear proliferation. And so going back to this theme of interrelatedness, the interrelatedness of these challenges, if you look at these 7 challenges individually, what binds them is the fact that Iran is integral to every single one of them. Iran has large, porous borders with both Afghanistan and Iraq, and is really integral to the future of both countries. It's going to be very difficult to create a stable, peaceful outcome in both countries as long as U.S.-Iran relations remain antagonistic. Iran has tremendous leverage over groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, which make it integral to the issue of both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and terrorism. Iran is the largest strategic and financial patron of the Assad regime in Syria. So any outcome, stable, peaceful outcome in Syria is likely going to require some type of a more constructive Iranian role. Iran has among the world's second or third largest reserves of both oil and natural gas, so it's integral to the issue of energy security. And as I mentioned, the nuclear issue is the one which has been the primary focus of the Obama administration and the Bush administration vis-a-vis Iran, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So I think that when President Obama came to office, January of 2009, he had a quick survey of all of these issues, and it was pretty obvious that Iran was integral to all of them. And he quickly deduced that ignoring Iran, shunning Iran, is no longer an option. That was by and large the approach taken during the previous 8 years, and it didn't really ameliorate any of these challenges. So he quickly deduced that we can no longer afford to ignore or shun Iran. We can't pretend like it's a problem which doesn't exist. I think he quickly also deduced that a military attack on Iran, bombing Iran, was likely going to exacerbate each of these issues. It was going to further destabilize Iraq and Afghanistan. It was going to make the price of oil skyrocket. And it was going to, rather than calm the region, it was going to add more fire to the region. So I think he quickly deduced that bombing Iran wasn't an attractive option, especially when much of his presidency was based on, and is based on, reducing America's footprint in the Middle East, not increasing America's footprint in the Middle East. So he quickly deduced that shunning Iran is not an option, bombing is not an option, and the option he was left with was this policy of what we call engagement, dialogue with Iran. And I think that the US policy debate on Iran is brilliantly framed by two quotes from former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And the first quote from Kissinger may surprise some of you, because Kissinger is seen as kind of the epitome of realist, pragmatic thinking. And this is a verbatim quote from Kissinger. He said, quote, "There are few nations in the world with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran." But the second quote from Kissinger was quite brilliant, and it's also quite brilliant in its simplicity. He said that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. If it sees itself as a nation and it pursues its own national interest, there's going to be tremendous overlapping interests between the United States and Iran. As I said, Iran shares long, porous borders with Afghanistan and Iraq. It's in Iran's interest to have a stable Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran has enormous reserves of oil and natural gas. It's in their interest to exploit those resources. And as Toby mentioned in the introduction, during the time of the Shah, there was a tremendous relationship between the United States and Iran. So I think what the Obama administration set out to do was probe that question. Is Iran a nation or a cause? There was a perception, and I believe this was an incorrect perception, but there was a perception during the Bush administration that the hostile behavior of the Iranian government was simply a reaction to the policies of the United States. That, the United States, we placed Iran in this axis of evil with Iraq and North Korea, and Iran was simply reciprocating that hostility. And so President Obama essentially set out to probe this question. Is Iran a nation or is it a cause? And I would argue that since he came to office, January of 2009, he's done more than any US president since the 1979 revolution to try to change the tone and the context of the US-Iran relationship. And this wasn't because, I think part of the reason was, I have heard this from the president's close advisors, that, as someone who comes from a biracial background, he's been bridging divides all his life. So he said, I can be the guy to bridge this U.S.-Iran enmity, which has persisted for over 3 decades. And so the Obama administration made what I would describe as unprecedented but unreciprocated overtures to Iran. He made private overtures in the form of a New Year's greeting on the occasion of the Persian New Year, making it clear to the Iranian leadership that the United States is interested in building confidence with Iran. He sent 2 private letters to the supreme leader in Iran to make it clear that America is no longer in the business of regime change. America is interested in trying to build confidence and mend relations with Iran. And again, I think that this, from the vantage point of the United States, made a whole lot of strategic sense, because Iran is one of the most populous nations in the Middle East. It has enormous influence throughout the region. And I think, as I said quickly, President Obama deduced that absent a more cooperative relationship with Iran, we're not going to be able to resolve these wider challenges in the region. But as I said, these overtures went unreciprocated by the Iranian government. So let me shift now to Tehran and try to kind of answer that question of why these overtures to Tehran went unreciprocated. And I think it's useful to start with a bit of historic context first and to rewind to the year 1989. 1989 was a very eventful year in the world. It was the year in which the Berlin Wall fell. But it was an especially eventful year within Iran as well, because it was the year in which the father of the Islamic Revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini, died. And Khomeini was in power from 1979 to 1989. And after he died, the custodianship of the Islamic regime was left to 2 men. One was called Hashemi Rafsanjani, who was the former president of, the Speaker of the Parliament, and he would become president of Iran. The second man was a man called Ali Khamenei, who was president of Iran, and he would become the supreme leader of Iran. And the 2 men have a very interesting relationship. I'm writing a book chapter about their relationship right now, which is entitled Shiite Shakespeare, because it's a very Shakespearean relationship in many ways, because they go back almost 5 decades, and they were comrades during the time of the Shah. They were comrades in arms against the Shah's government. When the revolution happened, they were initially partners. And as I said, after Khomeini died, there was this partnership between the 2 men. But over time, the rivalry between the 2 men began to grow more pronounced. And what transpired was essentially a fundamental difference in their worldview. And the worldview in terms of the direction in which the Islamic Revolution should head. The more moderate, pragmatic individuals, more moderate, pragmatic forces with Iran, like Rafsanjani, said, listen, 1979 was a different world. The revolution succeeded. We have now power in our hands. But what we need to do now, instead of focusing on revolutionary ideology, is focus on economic expediency. In order to preserve the revolution, we need to reform the revolution and start to put our economic interests before our ideological interests. And the model they had in mind, broadly speaking, was China. They said, we're not going to relinquish our power. We'll keep the political space for ourselves, but let's open up the economy. And let's ease social restrictions a bit. And the opposite school of thought was led by Khamenei, as I mentioned, Ayatollah Khamenei. And he had a very interesting perspective, which said, this was shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said to them, you fools, look at what happened when Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union. Once you start to compromise on your ideals, on your principles, that's when the entire system can unravel. And so it was kind of this battle of power between folks who hoped Iran could become like China and those who feared Iran could become like the Soviet Union. And that second model won out, this kind of more hardline intransigent model. And this has long been Khamenei's philosophy when it comes to both domestic politics and international politics, especially his relationship with the United States. And what's central to his worldview is that when you're being pressured, never compromise, because compromise doesn't alleviate that pressure. It shows weakness and invites even more pressure. And there was I think this was a seminal moment. It was a seminal moment in late 1978 when the Shah's regime hadn't yet collapsed, but when protests were continuing to grow in Tehran. And the Shah famously went on national television and he apologized to his population for past sins and past transgressions. And he very famously said, "I've heard the voice of your revolution." And what's interesting is that Khamenei was then a young revolutionary at that time. And he said that the Shah thought by going on television and apologizing to us, he thought he was going to quell the crowds. He was going to pacify the crowds. But what we saw was how weak and vulnerable he was. We smelled blood and we pounced. And if you look at now the way Iran handles its domestic uprisings, instead of offering compromise to their population, offering reform, they crush it immediately. And this is the advice they're giving to the Assad regime in Syria as well, their chief regional ally, that while you're being pressured, don't compromise. Because once you start to compromise, again, this is going to project weakness and invite even more pressure. And this is what is called kind of in political science, the dictator's dilemma. Because they fear that if they compromise, it's going to project weakness and lead to their demise. But when they don't compromise, the population is not quelled and they continue to protest. So when I talk about these principles of the Islamic Republic, the values, the ideals of the Islamic Republic, what are they? If I had to summarize them, I would say that the revolution in Iran, there's kind of, if you distill it down to its essence, there's three symbolic pillars left. And those are death to America, death to Israel, and the hijab, the veil for women, which is kind of the symbol of Islamic piety. And what's interesting I find about these three ideals is that especially the hostility towards the United States, it's cloaked in ideology, but it's really driven by self-preservation. What do I mean by that? For years, analysts of foreign policy, not just the Middle East, but Latin America, this is especially true with regards to Cuba, have said that if the United States engages rogue regimes, if we engage kind of authoritarian, isolated regimes, and we try to reintegrate them into the global economy, reintegrate them into the concert of nations, this is actually going to expedite political reform and political change within those countries. And the example oftentimes used is China. And I happen to believe this argument is probably true, that the more we integrate these kind of authoritarian, isolated regimes into the concert of nations, the more they will start to reform domestically. But I think what we're sometimes naive about is the shrewdness of these autocratic regimes, whether it's Ali Khamenei in Tehran, or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, or Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, or Fidel Castro in Cuba. And that they're also shrewd enough to appreciate the fact that global integration for them is inimical to their interests of staying in power, that they can much better preserve the status quo and isolation rather than with a policy of engagement. So let me shift now and just kind of I always tell people that if a great formulation, a shortcut formulation to understand the nature of the Iranian regime comes from Jon Stewart, the comedian Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart was talking once about Dubai, and those of you who have been to Dubai can attest to this. He said that Dubai is what happens when Las Vegas and Saudi Arabia have a baby. And if you take that Jon Stewart formulation and apply it to Iran, I would say that the Islamic Republic of Iran it's kind of become like a hybrid between the Taliban and the Soviet Union. It's not a superpower like the Soviet Union, it's a regional power. It's not as fundamentalist as the Taliban, but they still stone women to death for adultery. So it certainly has this strong Islamist ideology. And I think that some of the lessons from US policy towards the Soviet Union are instructive in our dealings with Iran. What do I mean by that? Let me shift for a minute to the nuclear issue. And the challenge of negotiating with Iran in the nuclear file. There's a wonderful book about negotiations in the United States, which is called Getting to Yes. It's by the late Harvard professor Roger Fisher. And I always joke that if one had to write a book on negotiations in Iran, it would be called Staying on Maybe. It's not a culture which gets quickly to yes. And the example I oftentimes use is the example of the carpet bazaar. And those of you who have traveled to the Middle East or to Iran have experienced this. But when you go to the carpet bazaar, one of the lessons that you learn from a very young age is that if you see something you really like, never show your hand to the merchant. Never tell him, I'm not going to leave your shop without that carpet. Because if he knows you really love that carpet, he knows he can extract a very high price for it. So you're always supposed to kind of feign indifference. And then, after 30 minutes of niceties and having tea, you finally kind of point to the carpet you like after having feigned indifference to it the last 30 minutes and saying, well, how much for that? And I think looking at this kind of superficial analogy in the context of the nuclear negotiations with Iran, one of the perennial challenges we've had is that we've shown Iran from the outset how obsessed we are with their nuclear carpet. And they say in exchange, well, if you feel so strongly about it, then offer us the corresponding price for it. And so in a way, there's kind of a direct correlation between the value we place on their nuclear program and the value that they place on the nuclear program. And so the harder we push, the harder the bargain they try to extract. And when it comes to Iran's nuclear ambitions, there's kind of three models which are commonly invoked. The first is the Libya model. What's the Libya model? Libya essentially gave up its nuclear program in response to inducements from the United States. This was, I believe, 2003. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program in exchange for reduction of sanctions and reintegration by the United States. Now, the Iranian regime, particularly the Iranian supreme leader, looks at the Libya model and he says, well, what happened when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program? It made himself vulnerable to NATO intervention, which led to his death a decade later. So the Libya model of giving up Iran's nuclear program isn't one which is particularly attractive to them. Now, the second model which is commonly invoked is the so-called Japan model. And Japan, as some of you may know, has an advanced nuclear program, but they don't have a nuclear weapon. They've never crossed that threshold. And they're a so-called screwdriver turn away from having a bomb. And the third option, which is commonly invoked, is the Pakistan or North Korea example of actually going and crossing that nuclear threshold and testing a device. And I would say that the Iranian regime is basically deciding between the last two options. Should they pursue only a nuclear weapons capability, but stop short of that, stop short of actually acquiring a nuclear weapon and testing a device, remaining a screwdriver turn away? Or should they actually cross that threshold and test a bomb like Pakistan, like North Korea? And I think, quite frankly, that the regime themselves have not decided what to do. And this is really the focus of the Obama administration, to compel and to coerce them to not cross that threshold and pursue a nuclear weapon. And I won't go into more detail now, but I'm happy to do that in the question session. What are the costs and benefits of each approach? Now, let me end by talking a bit about Iranian society, because I think it's truly unique when it comes to societies of the Middle East. As I've talked about, you have in the Iranian regime the most anti-American regime in the Middle East, if not one of the most anti-American regimes in the world. And interestingly, you have in the Iranian society the most pro-American population in the entire Middle East. And many travelers, journalists, photojournalists who visited Iran oftentimes say it's the most pro-American and hospitable place they visited in the world. So kind of, what explains this paradox, and how is it different from the other countries of the Middle East? What you see elsewhere in the Middle East, in countries like Egypt, I should say Mubarak-era Egypt, or Ben Ali-era Tunisia, or Assad-era Syria, is that the vast majority of the Arab autocratic regimes in the Middle East are secular dictatorships presiding over traditional, highly religious societies. And in Iran, you have the opposite dynamic. You have an Islamist regime which rules over what I would describe as a post-Islamist society. It's a popular, whereas elsewhere in the Middle East, and we're seeing this now as voting takes place in Egypt, we've seen this in Iraq, we saw this in the Palestinian territories, that when people go to the ballot box, they oftentimes vote for politicians who are interested in joining mosque and state. And in Iran, they've lived that experiment the last 3 decades. It's been terrible for people's quality of life. It's been terrible for people's social liberties, for people's political liberties. So it's the one place in the entire Middle East where they don't romanticize about joining mosque and state. They romanticize about separating mosque and state. And there was a wonderful experience I had when I was based in Tehran, interesting anecdote I had when I was based in Tehran. And I was going to interview the former president, Mohammad Khatami. And this was around 2005, and he was about to leave office. And I was in this taxi, and a lot of the taxi drivers in Iran are disgruntled former revolutionaries. They had tremendous hope in 1979, and now have become tremendously disillusioned. So it's very common, the first 30 minutes of the ride, he was just cursing the corruption and ineptness and cruelty of the regime. And after a little bit, I said, I'm about to have to kind of prepare to interview the president. Can we just kind of relax the last 10 minutes of the ride? He said, sure, no problem. And before he was about to drop me off, he said kind of out of the blue, Mr. Karim, do you like melon? There's a particular melon in Iran called kharbouza. He said, do you like melon? I said, sure, I like melon. He said, that's interesting. What about honey? Do you like honey too? I said, yeah, I like honey too. He said, Mr. Karim, never eat these two things together, melon and honey, because one is hot, one is cold. This is kind of an ancient philosophy of food. And they will create a stone in your stomach, so never eat these two together. So I said, okay. I promise I won't eat melon and honey together. And I thought, that's a bit odd. He was cursing the regime for 30 minutes, and now he tells me not to eat melon and honey together. As he was dropping me off, he said, Mr. Karim, religion is like melon, and politics is like honey. And, separately, both these things are necessary. Both politics are necessary and religion is necessary. But, when you mix them together, it ruins both religion and politics, and it creates a stone in your stomach. And I thought this was really quite remarkable. Someone who had a 7th grade education had become a secularist by experience. Not because the state tells him that religion and politics have to be separated, but because he learned over the course of 3 decades that when you mix these two together, you oftentimes taint both of them. And I am hopeful in a way about Iran's long-term future. There's a great line from Shimon Peres, the former Israeli prime minister, and he was talking about prospects for an Israeli-Palestinian peace resolution. And he said, the good news is that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and the bad news is there's no tunnel. And I think likewise when it comes to Iran, I see light at the end of the tunnel, and that you have a very young, dynamic population which strives to be part of the rest of the world, which isn't interested in radical Islam. They don't have pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini and Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah up on their walls. They have, pictures of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. They aspire to be part of the rest of the world. But when and how that process of change is going to take place is truly unpredictable, going back to what Trotsky said. And I think that the Arab world, each country is going to be different, but I would say in many cases they're unfortunately going to have to undergo the same type of process which Iranians underwent to kind of appreciate the value of separation of religion and state, the value of democracy, of political pluralism, and of tolerance. And I think what I'll end with is just to go back to the view from Washington again and the challenges which President Obama faces. There are 3 historic analogies which are commonly invoked in the foreign policy debate in Washington, which try to capture the nature of the Iranian regime. And each of these 3 historic analogies has a different implication for U.S. foreign policy toward Iran. And the first analogy which is commonly invoked is the China analogy. To say that, well, the Iranian regime may sound ideological, it says death to America every week, but it's really fundamentally pragmatic, not ideological. And if the United States makes a very bold gesture, just how Richard Nixon went to China, we can resolve this relationship and have a rapprochement. And I think going back to what I said earlier, that this is a regime in which their hostility towards the U.S. is cloaked in ideology but driven by self-preservation, makes the China analogy an exact one. I think President Obama would have loved to see a rapprochement with Iran, but it wasn't in the cards. You can't make amends, you can't make friends with a regime which needs you as an adversary for their own internal legitimacy. The second analogy, which is commonly invoked, and you'll hear, I think, this invoked by Israeli leadership, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, is to compare Iran to 1930s Germany and say, on the contrary, it's not a pragmatic regime, it's deeply ideological. They're religious fanatics, they're messianic, and we can't deter them because these guys are kind of radical jihadists, and therefore we need to think about taking military action. And what I say to that is that the Iranian regime is homicidal, but it's not suicidal, meaning what's paramount for the regime in Iran is to stay in power. They're not interested, when they conduct suicide operations, they outsource them to Palestinians and Lebanese. They don't actually do them themselves. And so, as I said, what was paramount for them is to remain in power, and they've shown this the last few decades. So I would also argue the Nazi Germany analogy is inexact. And I go back to, I think, one of the best minds in America, and that's the Jon Stewart formulation of the Soviet Union and the Taliban. And I think the lesson we can draw from our experience dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War is that dialogue with Iran, engagement with Iran, probably isn't going to resolve our differences. But the utility of dialogue and engagement with Iran isn't necessarily to resolve them. It's to contain them, to manage them, until this regime in Tehran goes the same direction that the Soviet Union went, meaning it eventually crumbles or is forced to transform under the weight of its own internal contradictions and economic malaise. And so let me leave you with that provocative note, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Karim, thank you very much. I heard you part of a panel about 9 months ago, and there were numerous people from very diverse backgrounds, Israelis and George Tenet and yourself and some others. And the discussion at that point was, what is the possibility of war in Iran? And as I remember, the odds that were given ranged somewhere between 50% and 20%. What do you think has happened since that time? Then while you're, by the way, there's a microphone on either side, and so you can ask your questions from those microphones.
It's a great question, Toby, and I think that living in Washington, I interact a lot with members of Congress, perhaps some of your representatives here, and I think there's this overwhelming sentiment throughout America that we need to start doing nation building at home. And we're tired of expending all this blood and treasure in the Middle East. And I think if you look at President Obama's reluctance to intervene, even intervene indirectly in Syria, it's kind of a testament to that. There's been 80,000 casualties, more than 1 million people displaced. And there's this remarkable reluctance, given all that we've expended over the last years in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think from the vantage point of the Obama administration, they're doing everything in their power to try to coerce and compel the Iranian regime to compromise on their nuclear ambitions, but trying to do that in a peaceful manner. Now, I think that the way the Israelis see the situation is slightly different, and that Iran doesn't represent U.S. No U.S. official would tell you that Iran represents an existential threat to the United States. We have over 5,000 nuclear weapons. Iran is maybe a couple of years away from one nuclear weapon. So it's not an existential threat to the United States, but Israel's leadership oftentimes does use that term. It's an existential threat. And what's interesting is when I talk to Israeli officials about this issue, that, what is it that most worries you about a nuclear-armed Iran, the prospect of Iran with a bomb? What's interesting is that it's rare that they'll say that they think Iran will actually use a nuclear weapon to lob it into Israel. But what's oftentimes said is that if this particular regime in Tehran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, they would feel this cloak of immunity to continue to support radical groups which reject Israel's existence, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad. So they would kind of double down on the behavior which we find problematic. And second, I remember the former Israeli ambassador in Washington once told me this. He said that if this particular regime in Tehran, whose rhetoric is so odious toward Israel, the Iranian president Ahmadinejad has denied the Holocaust, they reject Israel's existence. If this particular regime gets their hand on a nuclear weapon, this is going to it's going to create a black cloud hovering over the state of Israel, which will make it much more difficult for diaspora Jews, recruit diaspora Jews to come and live in Israel, and it could well hasten immigration away from Israel. So I think there's kind of useful context there. Why is this issue of such great concern? Now I think that one of the most important foreign policy lines of Obama's first term was he said that he has a policy of preventing a nuclear-armed Iran, not containing a nuclear-armed Iran. So he has a policy of prevention, not containment. What that implies, what's implicit in that, is that if he's faced with a binary choice, either Iran gets the bomb or the US is forced to take military action against Iran to prevent Iran from getting a bomb, he'll take the former option. And I think there's a debate about whether we should take him at his word for that. I think that some folks, those officials who have worked with him, take him at his word and said he's committed to preventing this possibility. So if Iran goes down that route, he's prepared to use military action. There are others who argue that he's not. But what I would simply argue is that he is at the moment committed to doing everything possible to try to prevent having to make that decision, to prevent having to make that binary choice. And this is why you see, if you look at his national security cabinet, Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, these are two of the most pro-Iran engagement national security officials since the 1979 revolution. And I think that the Israelis recognize that it doesn't behoove them, that they're much more limited in their capacity to significantly set back Iran's nuclear program. So they would like the United States to do it. So the long answer to the question is, I still, if you ask me to quantify what are the odds of military action against Iran in the year 2013, I would say less than 20%. And part of that is also due to the fact that Iran isn't driving its car to Nuclearville 80 miles an hour. They're taking a very deliberate pace, 15 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour. And so for that reason, if I'm not optimistic that we're able to resolve this issue. But I am fairly optimistic that we're going to be able to manage it, at least in 2013. Please.
Mr. Sadjadpour, thank you for being here. Your talk was very fascinating. You touched briefly on Israel and the U.S. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on the degree of influence the Israel lobby has in Washington, and then to what degree that plays into policymaker decisions and management in Iranian relations.
It's a very good question. And, I think that one of the pillars of U.S. strategy and U.S. policy toward the Middle East is ensuring Israel's national security. The word sacrosanct is commonly used by President Obama, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to describe Israel's national security. And I think the other side of that coin is that any regime like Iran, which rejects Israel's existence and has aspirations for at least a nuclear weapons capability, should be prevented from acquiring that. I remember George W. Bush's former speechwriter David Frum once told me several years back, he said, in the context of domestic American politics, you can enrich uranium, a country can enrich uranium, and it can call for Israel to be wiped off the map, but you can't do both at the same time. And I think this is one of the challenges which Iran poses, that it has, as I said, it rejects Israel's existence and has aspirations of a nuclear weapons capability. I would say, however, and this goes back to that Kissinger quote, that this hostility which Iran exhibits toward Israel isn't actually a reflection of either Iranian national interests or Iranian popular sentiment. This is a nation which isn't Arab, it's Persian. People are very proud of the fact that they're Persian. They have their own kind of distinct language, history, civilization, food. And I think a lot of Iranians say, well, if the Palestinian leadership themselves, or at least part of the Palestinian leadership and a significant part of the leadership of the Arab world, if they themselves have come to terms with the idea of a two-state solution, why should we be more Catholic than the Pope, right? If they've signed off on it, why should we be sacrificing our own interests for this? And I think that the issue you touch upon is really, I would argue, the fundamental stumbling block to a U.S.-Iran rapprochement. This, from the U.S. vantage point, as long as Iran continues to reject Israel's existence and support these radical groups, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, etc., I don't think there's ever going to be an improvement in the relationship. But I think the day in which you see a government in Tehran which is more reflective of popular will, which is a popularly represented government, I think you will start to see a shift in that relationship between Iran and Israel. And I think, frankly, that will be a prerequisite to a better U.S.-Iran relationship.
Hi. Thank you very much so far for all of your insight. You mentioned at the beginning that the outreach done by the president has really gone unanswered. So what advice, other than letters and things like that, do you give the president in how we move foreign relations forward? And then two, how do you prioritize the issues you also mentioned? Energy, terrorism, etc. I can imagine that the American people probably have the pressures for terrorism because we all understand it with the Boston bombings and things like that. So does that play a key role, or does something like energy take more of a precedence?
That's a great question, very difficult question. I should say that the president has never solicited my advice on these issues, thankfully. But, in terms of the strategy, what should be our strategy toward Iran? What I think is that continuing to try to engage Iran, continuing to try to talk to Iran, is, in my opinion, a win-win situation. What do I mean by that? If we continue to reach out to Iran, I'm not saying that we send Iran gifts and we acquiesce on our values and things like that, but continuing to try this policy of dialogue with them. If they, for some reason, feel under tremendous pressure and they begin to reciprocate and we're able to build confidence with them, I think that's good. That's good for U.S. national security. That's good for U.S. national interests. I think that's good for the Iranian people. So it's a win. Now, if we continue to try to engage them, reach out to them, and they continue to rebuff us, I also think there's a value in that. And the reason why I say that is I think that we expose the fact that Iran is the intransigent actor in this equation, not the United States. I can tell you that when I was doing this job during the Bush administration, it was very interesting for me when I would interact with European officials and certainly Chinese and Russian officials. They would oftentimes complain more about Washington's unwillingness to engage Iran than Iranian intransigence. And they would say, listen, we've just gotten yourselves into this terrible war with Iraq, and now is the time for diplomacy with Iran. No one is interested in getting into another war. And what's interesting when I interact with European, Chinese, and Russian officials now, there's almost a universal appreciation that Obama actually did make tremendous effort to try to build confidence with Tehran and to resolve this issue. And the Iranians didn't reciprocate. And this is why you see really an unprecedented international sanctions regime against Iran. You have Russian participation, Chinese participation. The Europeans have embargoed Iranian oil, something which no one ever thought would happen. So I think from a strategic perspective, from a policy perspective, continuing to try to dialogue and engage with them is useful. It's a win-win. Now, I am one who believes that this issue is never going to be resolved until we have a representative government in Tehran. You have a different regime in Tehran because, as I mentioned, this current regime, their ethos, their identity is premised on this hostility towards the United States. So you can't make friends with a regime which needs you as an adversary. And in order to expedite political reform, political change in Iran, I would put, from the vantage point of the United States, I would put all my efforts into one basket. And that's the basket of media, communication, information. Because what the Iranian regime is trying to do is to inhibit, they're trying to keep their population in the dark, trying to inhibit people from getting information from the outside world, from communicating with the outside world, from communicating with one another. And I think the more we inhibit their ability to do that, the more we shine a light on what's going on elsewhere in the world, I think the tougher it will be for them to retain that status quo. And so I said this, Toby, when we were in Sun Valley together, that in a way I really think that companies like Google and Apple and Twitter will actually probably play a much more important role in Iran's democratization than the State Department or the Pentagon. So, and I think I missed the second part of your question.
It was really, how do you prioritize the issues?
How do you prioritize, yeah. Mm-hmm. Listen, from my vantage point, at the moment, I think it's very tough to ignore the situation in Syria. As I said, you know, this is a nation of approximately 20 million people. 80 to 100,000 people have been killed. Something like a quarter of the population is displaced, becoming refugees. And I think that's a humanitarian crisis which cannot be ignored. And I understand the president's reluctance to intervene. He's worried about being drawn into an Islamist briar patch. You know, there's one of the elements of the Syrian civil war is a fight between Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, two enemies of the United States. So I think they look at that and say, why should we, when your two of your worst enemies are fighting, just let them continue fighting. Why should we intervene? But I think looking at it from a humanitarian perspective, it's, I really think it requires a greater U.S. role, and that, you know, is partly diplomatic. It's partly trying to tilt the balance towards those forces in Syria which we would like to see prevail. There's no simple solutions. It's very messy. I'm happy to follow up more on this, but for me, Syria would be the top priority.
Yeah. Thank you again, Mr. Sadjadpour, for educating all of us today. Throwing it back to the tensions with Iran, obviously the major players in the situation are Iran, the U.S., Israel, but there are plenty of other countries that have an interest in, I guess, the outcome of the situation. You mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq. I think maybe one of the more unique players, or maybe potential players in the situation, could be Azerbaijan. I know relations with Iran have been kind of icy as of the past several months. And obviously Azerbaijan has its own problems both domestically and with Armenia. But at the same time, Azerbaijan has a significant ethnic population living in Iran. I believe it's upwards of 15 million. And then at the same time, both in terms of business and culture, Azerbaijan is kind of seeing this shift towards the West. And even in terms of security, I know it's been reported that Azerbaijan has allowed Israel to keep some of their fighter jets there. So with Azerbaijan kind of touching on all three of the major players, do you think they could have any type of role in maybe bridging some sort of divide?
It's a great question, and the short answer is no. I think that, you know, in order to be, there's actually very few countries in the world that have a close relationship with Washington and a close relationship with Tehran. In order to be an effective mediator, you really have to have the trust of both capitals. And Azerbaijan has a close relationship with the United States, as you mentioned. but they don't have that trust with the Iranian government, which would be needed in order to play some type of a mediator role. Now, you touched on a couple issues which I think are worthwhile mentioning, and that is the ethnic diversity of the Iranian population. The word Persian and Iranian is oftentimes used interchangeably, but I think as you alluded to, about upwards of 50% of Iranians are actually quote-unquote Persians, a Persian ethnicity. But you also have a quarter of the population which is ethnically Azeri Turk. You have Kurds, you have Baluchis, you have even a small Arab minority in Iran. But what's really interesting about the Iranian nation, there's a wonderful quote from a late Egyptian statesman called Tassin Bashir. And he said there's really only two real nation states in the Middle East, and that's Egypt and Iran. And the rest of these countries are just tribes with flags. And, if you look at the history of the Middle East, a lot of these nations which we're currently preoccupied with, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, they didn't exist until the 20th century. Iran as a nation state goes back 2,500 years. And so I think it is very much worthwhile mentioning this diversity, ethnic diversity in Iran, but at the same time this tremendous sense of national cohesion and national unity and national pride. There was a very interesting poll which was conducted by, I believe it was Pew. Pew conducted a poll 5-6 years ago which asked people around the world how proud they were to be of their nationality. And Iran finished number one in the world. 94% of Iranians said they were very proud to be Iranian. The United States was towards the top, and only 71% of Americans said they were very proud. 30% of Italians said they were very proud. But so I think that this is something which, from the standpoint of U.S. national security and U.S. foreign policy, that's actually useful to have a regime which, or I should say, a nation which isn't unraveling before your eyes. Iraq is potentially not sustainable as a nation state. It may be that a nation called Iraq in its current form doesn't exist 10, 15 years from now. That well could be the case about Syria as well. But this is an advantage, I think, that Iran has. But I don't see Azerbaijan being able to play an outsized role at the moment, but certainly in the future, as you start to see more transformation in Iran, I can see that happening.
Karim, thank you very much. You've been terrific to have here. You've enlightened us enormously, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Well, as always, we have come away from a great hour, greatly enlightened and appreciating what great minds have come to us and have brought to us as far as our understanding is concerned. And we're going to take a summer break. We'll see you back in the fall with continuing our series. I'm delighted that Don Berwick is going to be here in December. Don, as you know, was one of the instigators and leaders of the Accountable Care Act and head of the CMS and just recently left that, and he will bring to us a great perspective. There are several others that we have lined up as dates yet to be determined, and we'll keep you posted on that. So thank you very much for being here today. We really enjoyed it, and thanks again for Karim.